A Little History of the World was written in 1935 by Ernst Gombrich. Gombrich had an art history doctorate and was invited by a publisher to attempt a history book that would be attractive for younger readers, and amazingly, the 26-year-old accomplished this task in an intense 6 weeks. A Little History of the World is the result, hugely successful, available in multiple languages, an English translation being one of them, which Gombrich worked on towards the end of his life, along with a revision. And the book is just that, a little history of the world we live in, a little history of man's time on earth, told in 40 concise chapters. You have the Ice Age, the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Jews, the Greeks, the Spartans, the Romans, the European kingdoms, and the numerous battles, and so on and so forth. And we end just after World War I. The most remarkable thing about this book is the way in which it is told. Rather than be drowned in investigative analysis, references, dates and names like a lot of history books, the best feature of A Little History of the World is how accessible the work is. It is told in such simple fashion. The events are covered like you're reading a storybook, and it really does come across as a series of tales being told by a knowledgeable grandpa as you lie down and listen and learn after he's tucked you into bed. It's definitely a book that can be read by younger audiences, and mature readers would also no doubt learn many things. Some of those things being things a lot of us don't even think about, like the origin of the days of the week. For those already vested in history, the book is a good chance to strengthen the framework in your mind and connect the dots between different events and historical civilizations you're already aware of. It was cool, for example, to learn of a group that separated itself from the church, and the details and history of this, and then Gombrich to declare that these people were known as Protestants. And as a reader, you go, oh, I know what a Protestant is, so that's how they started off. It really is a delightful book, so informative and yet never boring, greatly detailed, concisely told, aside from the final few chapters where it covers recent European history, which even the author himself states is really confusing. I do, however, have some complaints. The first is that it's really quite simple in places and very detailed in others. You might have a phenomenon that occurred in history, a war or whatever, that you would imagine would be covered in a few paragraphs. There will be entire books dedicated to the subject, but Gombrich will say something like, I don't know, the English then fought the French and won. Like really basic, really simple and short. And then there are paragraphs dedicated to the facial structure of certain historical figures. And you're thinking, did we really need to go into such detail at the expense of huge events that occurred in history? The book's title, though, is its defense to this complaint, and probably to my next one as well, because after all, it's a little history of the world, nothing more. So you could argue it does what it says on the tin. My next issue is that it is extremely selective. In fact, it is so Eurocentric, it really should be called something like A Little History of Europe and the Surrounding Areas. The book is written by a German for German children, so Germanic affairs are given precedence over other things. For example, 5 pages are dedicated to Frederick II, ruler of Germany in the 13th century, and yet the 100-Year War is dealt with in just over a page, and many historical figures that had arguably a far greater impact than Frederick, like Henry II, are not even mentioned. And that's still, by the way, sticking with Europe. When you expand to, well, the subject of the book, the world, it doesn't even skim the surface. Buddha and Confucius get a mention, there's a brief look at the inception of Islam, a few glances at China and Japan, the Ottoman Empire was mentioned once, but that's about it really. It's stunning how little is covered in the book outside of Western Europe. African history and that of South America are almost completely absent, and that of the subcontinent and the Eastern world. There was one part that was particularly head-scratching when you consider the death and suffering Gombrich covers in the book, where he gets to the Native Americans, and he says, there in Mexico and in other parts of America, the Spaniards proceeded to exterminate the ancient cultivated Indian peoples in the most horrendous ways. This chapter in the history of mankind is so appalling and so shameful to us Europeans that I would rather not say anything more about it. What the hell, man? Just because you're ashamed of it, you're not going to cover it? What's all that about? The human suffering from the Native Americans was specifically associated with manifest destiny. It's almost disingenuous to just skip it, which is what the author does. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't even covered. There was just a tiny line about Africans being treated bad, and the following sentence. So as you can imagine, the native inhabitants were often very badly treated if any of them tried shooting at the invading troops with their bows and arrows. If any of them tried shooting at the invading troops with their bows and arrows. So what he's saying, everyone was skipping around campfires holding hands, whilst natives were being subject to genocide and slavery, and they were only treated badly if those pesky Africans caused trouble. Is that really what Gombrich is saying? And this is something I noticed, a kind of condescending tone, a kind of dismissal, when concerning people who are not European, which is ironic because throughout the book, Gombrich calls for equality between all people. And one final thing is that the book contains straight-up mistakes. Let me give an example. I know one or two things about Islam. I believe I have relatively a healthy amount of knowledge on it, both historically and dogmatically. I've reviewed several Islamic books, for example, on the channel. And it says in the book regarding the Prophet Muhammad, he taught them that they should fear nothing and no one but God, or Allah in Arabic, that it was futile to either fear or to look forward to the future with joy, for their fate had already been ordained by God. That bit about not fearing or looking forward just isn't true. It's a massive misunderstanding on part of the author. Islam teaches that human beings have free will, that they possess the ability to do whatever they want within their means, and have been given a set of rules to follow, which they do so via their free will. But what choices they make, what will happen in their life, God already knows, because God is not constrained by time and space, these themselves being creations of God. So you've got destiny and free will. Simple, but Gombrich seemingly didn't get it. And then Gombrich goes on to say, quoting the Quran, or the Quran, because he spells it in the colonialist method, I might add, "Slay the idolatrous wherever you shall find them, capture them, beseech them, seek them out in all places, but if they convert, then let them go in peace." Gombrich uses this verse to go on to say that the Muslims used this to kill all non-Muslims, and even says, crazily, that once all the infidels had been killed or converted, the Muslims moved on to other territories to continue their mission, completely ignoring the fact that in Muslim Arabia freedom of religion existed, and there were plenty of, for example, Jews and Christians in the land, unslayed, when Muslims took over. That verse, chapter 9, verse 5, is very famous because it's what Islamophobes today try to quote to prove that Islam is a violent religion, but what they fail to understand is that the verse was in relation to a specific treaty that was made between the Muslims and the pagans of Arabia, and upon the pagans breaking the treaty and killing Muslims, the Muslims were ordered to fight back. And that's a verse related to a specific historical event, which Gombrich should have known. And when he talks about Islam teaching that all people of other religions should be killed, how does he reconcile the Quran saying there is no compulsion in religion, and another verse which says, "For you is your religion, and for me my religion," when referencing unbelievers? And Islam is not some distant alien faith. At the time of the writing of the book, it was the second largest religion in the world. The world had just seen the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted 600 years. Those aren't small mistakes to make. And not only that, Gombrich goes as far as to include myths in his book of history, like the supposed Muslim burning of the Library of Alexandria, a tale which has already been debunked by the time he wrote this book. Now he does acknowledge it as a myth, but why include that? And when an author makes such blatant errors like this about stuff you know, it makes you skeptical about the things you don't. All of a sudden, you're thinking to yourself, how much of what I just read is Gombrich misunderstanding history, or the result of a task which he should have really spent more than 6 weeks on? So overall, it is a book I enjoyed, but you really do have to take things with a pinch of salt and remind yourself that this is a little bit of selective history on a very Eurocentric world. Thanks for watching.